Well, I learned so much. I couldn't take it. Yes, please. Um, the pastor here at this church is a retired Navy guy, and I was in the Army Reserves. I was deployed, and both of us can tell you about people we've seen with courage. But I want you to know you have courage. What a wonderful character trait. And courage comes in all sizes and shapes. And right. Well, we're going to talk about Born This Way, homosexuality, science, and scripture. And let me go ahead and tell you, I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions, but I can point you into the trajectory of where the science is at. It's interesting. Right now, I am reading, for the first time in my life, Augustine's Confessions. Now, I'm from Georgia, and we like to say St. Augustine. Now, if I can help you out, St. Augustine is in Florida. Augustine is in heaven, right? But Augustine's Confessions, I'd read amazing, I read City of God, which goes on forever. I deserve the pastor of this church is a retired Master Chief. I was served some sort of combat duty badge for finishing City of God in its entirety, the Loeb Classical Library. But nonetheless, Confessions is much shorter. One of the things I would tell you is Augustine was extremely far away from God. You talked about Gnosticism. You guys are both bringing up Gnosticism. He was in a Gnostic cult, Manichaeism, which is what it was. And he spent, I read last night, 9 years. He dated himself 9 years in that cult, is what he said. And he finally figures out there's nothing there. He's living with a woman. They have a child out of wedlock. And he's in North Africa. And he sets sail from Carthage to Rome because he wants to go where the stuff is really happening at. He wants to go to Rome. And he thinks he's going to make more money, too, as a teacher. His mother is on the seashore with him before he leaves for Rome, and his mother, Monica, is a devout Christian, and she's crying for him. And in the book, several times he talks about his mother's tears. He talks about his mother weeping for him because he's so far away from God, doesn't care about the things of God. He's standing on the seashore, and she says, well, I'm going to Rome with you. So she's going to Rome with him, his living lover, and his out-of-wedlock child. She's going to go with him. And he doesn't want her along. Imagine that. He doesn't want mother along as he's moving to Rome with his living girlfriend. But he tells her, okay, well, we're going to leave in the morning. And she goes back to the house. He said, no, we're leaving tonight. And he slips away. Interesting thing, she went to the bishop of I think it was their town, Tagaste, at some point, and talks to him about visiting with Augustine. She basically wants the bishop to go straighten him out. And the bishop was a very wise man. He said something, I'm paraphrasing now, I don't know what God's going to do in your son's life. I don't think he's done with him, but I don't think he's ready to listen to me right now. Can you imagine that? A pastor says, I'm not going to talk to your son right now. 1,600 years later, we say, well, that's the right decision. But at the moment, I bet his mother was ticked off. Her name was Monica. Well, you're a pastor. You're supposed to talk to my son. You're not doing what you're. But it was a very wise man that knew at that point he was not ready to hear what he had to say. He goes to Rome. He discovers the students in Rome are better behaved than those in Carthage, but they're bad about paying their bills. So he goes to Milan. He's a teacher of rhetoric. The best speaker in Milan is a pastor of a church. We'd call him a bishop. His name is Ambrose. So he kind of hooks up with Ambrose because he wants to hear the best speaker in town so he can learn about rhetoric. He's not really interested in Christianity. He winds up coming to faith in Jesus Christ. I tell you all that to say, one of the mountains in the history of the Christian church, Augustine, was in a Gnostic cult with his living girlfriend and his out-of-wedlock child running away from his mother, and he doesn't want to talk to the local church pastor. Don't you give up on your kids. Don't you give up on your kids. The last chapter has not been written. Well, let me say a few things, which I'm good at doing, is saying a few things. Here's the song Lady Gaga, Born This Way. If you've not heard it, it actually has a catchy beat. No matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgendered life, I'm on the right track, baby, I was born to survive. No matter black, white, beige, chola or cola, depends on how you pronounce it, from which region of Hispanic community or Orient made, I'm on the right track, baby, I was born to be brave. Quick side note, she uses the word chola or cola in a positive way. In some Hispanic communities, it's a bit of a put down, but they give her a pass on this song. Let me ask you, what two things is she paralleling in those two stanzas right there? What is she paralleling? In stanza 1, what's she talking about? No matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgendered life. What's she talking about there? sexual orientation, identity, whatever it might be. The second stanza, black, white, beige, cola, or orient made. What's she talking about there? Right. Do you see what she's paralleling? And if you understand Lady Gaga's argument right there, then you understand the position and the moral stance of a lot of people who are counselors in your schools, perhaps a professional you might meet in the mental health field or sometimes in the medical profession. The idea is that just as surely as one is born with a particular race or ethnic heritage over which we had no control, in the same degree, one is born with a particular sexual identity over which one has no control. And here's where the punchline comes. We all agree that it's wrong to discriminate against someone because of race, and everybody said, okay, now I know I'm in Rhode Island and I'm from Georgia, but you can do better than that. So we like an interactive congregation where I come from. I realize that that may be a bit odd. But nonetheless, just as surely as it's wrong to discriminate against someone because of their ethnic heritage or their race, the argument's being made that a sexual identity is somehow in the same category. It's something over which one has no control, and so it is also wrong for us to discriminate against someone because of their sexual identity. So the question is that true? I mean, is that claim true? That's the big question. So what we're going to talk about today for the next few minutes is why a sexual identity is not the same as your race. That's the big point. They're not the same, and so my thesis is they're not the same thing. And then God's brought into it. I'm beautiful in my own way because God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. It's got a catchy beat, which is more than I can say for a lot of modern music, so I will give it that. But it's she's made a point. I remember one day, I know that I'm a senior adult now, getting close there. I'm 54. I'm not quite a senior adult. AARP has mailed me, which I was violently offended by that. But amen. Why? For a lot of, I'm not ready for that. But I was at the gym one day at lunch, and there's all people with men with my hairline and my hair color. You understand what I'm saying? And they were playing this song, and I was looking around the gym. They were playing this song, and all these senior adults in their 60s, about 10 years old, they're all bebopping along to Lady Gaga. I'm on my right track. Here's what I want you to know. She's selling you something there, and what she's selling is biological determinism. It's a worldview. Now, she brings God in, sort of try to give some spiritual feeling to it so we can all feel good about bringing religion in on her side. By the way, Macklemore does the same thing in his song, Same Love. But here's the idea, is biological determinism. So the question is biological determinism true? So here's some talking points. It's not a trait like skin color. No one has found a gay gene. No variable has been discovered which is necessary and sufficient for homosexuality. And you could put that down for the entire LGBTQ spectrum of ideas. By the way, a lot of you guys have asked about the PowerPoints. You're going to email them to everybody on the email list. They're just going to mail them out to you. And I want to stress to a lot of the pastors and Bible teachers here, if my stuff fits your gun, my bullets fit your gun, you're free to shoot it. Just put your name on it. If you want to use it on a Wednesday night or a Sunday morning or something, feel free to. Predisposition doesn't equal predetermination. I appreciated the discussion we had in Dr. Cotella's previous session. And yes, we want to talk about that. Correlation doesn't equal causation. I would also add one more bullet point here. A big problem in a lot of this is people are really bad at statistics. The average person is. And what do you mean by that, Branch? Well, what I mean is they play the lottery and then they're afraid to fly on an airplane, right? So people are bad at statistics. I guess I got more lottery players here than I thought. But nonetheless, yeah, those scratch-off tickets are not going to get you out of poverty. But the point is, if you think about it, the lottery, your chance of winning is 1 in gazillion or whatever. But your chance of dying in an airplane crash is actually freakishly low, and yet people play the lottery, but then they're afraid to fly on an airplane. You see what I'm saying? People are bad at statistics. So some of what you're dealing with is how do we use statistics and moral argumentation, and what can this data tell us? I'm not a statistician, but I feel like I can point out a few things to help you think about this. Let's talk about prenatal hormones. Dr. Cotella has brought this up this morning, and across the LGBTQ spectrum, what I find is some version of this theory is getting the most traction. I won't bore you with all the details about different versions of this theory, but here's basically the hypothesis. Got it? And I will tell you, it has an explanatory appeal for many people because it's really actually simple. And I think the simplicity of it has a certain elegance that attracts people. And it also gives a way for people to think about why they are the way they are right now. And one of the things I would say as well, and a lot of the data I'm about to show you, if you do any research in this area, what strikes you is the degree to which the people doing the research have an LGBTQ identity of their own. I mean, over and over again. So the preacher in me so often feels that these are people trying to understand, why am I the way I am? And I love the Lord so much, and my heart goes out so often that these are folks that are trying to understand, why am I the way I am? And my heart grieves. This is, I'm going to skip past Troy Perry. Let's talk about the prenatal hormone theory. It's conceptually pretty simple. And the idea is that hormones drive sexual development. So what the theory says is this, that early on in pregnancy, and I have two pediatricians here, I'm scared to death. I've never said this in a room with two pediatricians. I'm frightened at this moment. Master Chief, I wish I was back in the NBC chamber at Fort Jackson, where they're spraying the tear gas on me. But here it is. The theory is early in pregnancy and the gestational development, the genitalia differentiate first. And then the theory is that later on, the brain sexually differentiates later in pregnancy. So the idea is that for someone across the LGBTQ spectrum, whatever that may be, that their genitalia early on in pregnancy differentiated consistent with the person's genetics. So you have an XX and it differentiated like a girl, XY differentiated like a boy. Then the theory is that something goes awry later on in development, although some of them would disagree when I say something goes awry. They would just say, no, it's just a natural variation, so it's not, something's wrong. But anyway, the idea is the brain later on in prenatal development gets the wrong hormones, or gets, for whatever reason, sometimes they'll suggest the brain doesn't process the sex hormones correctly. Sometimes they'll suggest that it gets waves of the wrong hormones. So the idea is stage one, the genitals differentiate like the DNA, but then stage two, the brain differentiates like the opposite sex. Thus, that's why someone is born with a male body but then feels like a female or feels attraction to the same sex or something. And there's all these different theories about why that's so, and different mechanisms that will be suggested that actuate this. But here it is. Basically, they're going to argue that homosexuals, and I say homosexuals here, it should say any LGBTQ identity, get the discordant hormone for their sex during brain development. So they're going to suggest boys got girl hormones and girls got boys hormones. And I've talked to numerous people, have family members that tell them I have a boy brain and a female body and this sort of thing. Well, the question is that true? And it's often based on animal research. We should stop and have a moment of silence for the things that rodents have gone through for humans to increase knowledge about ourselves. But, well, among many things that have been done is scientists have taken little baby embryonic mice and rats and given them, and they can tell if this is a male or a female rat in utero, or a male or female mouse, and they will inject the opposite sex hormones into these embryonic mice and rats, and then they want to see what they look like and how they act when they are born. And so what you discover is these animals that have gotten the wrong hormones in utero, when they're born and they reach male age, for reproductive age for those animals, sometimes the boy rats that were given the female hormones in utero will go around and present themselves to other male rats for mounting, as in a sexual act. Sometimes the female mice who got the male hormones in utero will go around and they will try to mount, as in a sexual act, other female mice. And they say, aha, we have gay rats and gay mice, and see, this proves the theory. Well, there's a couple of things that's not often told you. What some of the research doesn't tell you is if those male rats that were given the wrong hormones that present themselves to other male rats, if the researchers put their hands down in there with a glove and start stroking their back, those little rats will present themselves to be mounted just by someone stroking their back with a gloved hand. What am I saying? Animals act instinctively. Humans are volitional. So it shouldn't surprise us that if you load up male rats with the wrong hormones. But I realize I'm in Rhode Island. I grew up in the country in Georgia. And we had horses when I was a boy. And if you've ever had horses, you have a stallion or you have a mare and you have enough of them and you're around them long enough, sooner or later you will see a stallion go try to mount another stallion. And I would suggest to you that people living in rural context have seen animal doing that for millennia. It's only in the last 50 years that suddenly people say, hey, let's leverage animal behavior for human moral behavior. Let's do that. And the question is, why is that? I think it's the Disneyfication of our thinking. And what do I mean by that? As people have moved away from the farm, they don't know much about animals anymore. And sometimes I feel like I have to tell the young college students, animals don't do choreographed dances. They can't talk. This is not like Lion King, okay? They don't know. They don't dance. Wow. So animals act instinctively. Humans are volitional. And just keep that in mind. Other thing I would say is disorders of sexual development, but you use the phrase sex development. Should I use sex development? I'm using the word sexual. You like the word sex?
I like this the best.
Do you really?
This is the original, yeah.
Oh.
Either one.
Okay. No, I like to use the proper terms because there's always.
Now they say disorders of sex development.
Okay.
They're trying to get over to disorders of sex difference.
Because development implies that there's something gone awry, but we want to say that nothing is awry. And so here you go. We've already talked about this. Dr. Catella has talked about DSDs this morning. I want to talk about one DSD in particular. And by the way, she gave some interesting data you need to listen to. You use the data about 0.02% of DSD. You need to watch out. Some people in the intersex movement will give you these freakishly high numbers about how many people are born with a DSD, and they'll say, well, like 1 in 1,000. I've heard numbers lower than that, 1 in 500. Okay, let me just tell you, that's not true. It all depends on how you define a DSD. Let me give you an example. Sometimes on little boys, the opening for the urethra gets in the wrong place, and instead on the tip of the penis, it will wind up on the underside of the penis or down at the bottom. There's no question whether or not this is a boy. His urethra opening is just in the wrong place. Thankfully, with modern science, these things can be corrected at the right time and the right place. I don't think anybody in this room would call that a DSD, but you will have some people who are highly motivated that want to put those sort of things into their data. Why? Because it's pretty common, relatively speaking, and it makes their data look better for how many. So it's all about how you define things and how you use data. But what I want to talk, there's no ethical way to perform experiments on humans to prove the prenatal hormone theory. It would require us taking children in utero, giving them the wrong hormones, and looking at what they do 30 and 40 years later. And as of right now, we don't do that. And there's one or two countries in the world that might find it ethical, but we don't. So what you have to do is a disorder of sexual development provides a natural experiment. What you know is these children got discordant hormones in utero, and I want to talk about one. There are several. I'm only going to talk about one. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia can affect both sexes, but for our purposes, we want to focus on girls. A baby girl produces too much androgen in utero and can develop genitalia with male characteristics. Their clitoris looks much like a phallus. And sometimes the labial folds will actually fuse together, and it can be quite disconcerting. So this is a DSD. The question is, we know that these girls got the wrong hormones in utero, so what is their sexual identity when they grow older? It provides a natural experiment where we, in ethical ways, can try to find out how hormones affect sexual identity later. So what you find is this. The large majority of girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia self-identify as heterosexual, and they self-identify as non-transgender. You're looking at about 90%. Now, a higher percentage, and that's usually about 10%, self-identify as somewhere across the LGBTQ spectrum. If you use the data from the Williams Institute out at UCLA, but I will tell you these numbers are going up. It's not a stable evolutionary trait. But anyway, the numbers are going up. But if you use the Williams Institute data out of UCLA from about 10 or 15 years ago, they were saying somewhere south of 2% of Americans identify across the LGBTQ spectrum. But I will also tell you that number goes down if you measure it by sexual activity in the last year. It's interesting. If you ask people to say, what do you identify, LGBTQ? If you just say, how do you identify? You say, well, yeah, okay, you get about 2% or maybe just slightly north of that. If you start asking, okay, as defined by your sexual behavior in the last year, how many people are LGBTQ? It actually drops about half. Fascinating. So it's all about identity and behavior and what's going on. Anyway, I say all that to tell you, the vast majority of these girls self-identify as heterosexual and they identify with their birth sex. A higher percentage than the general population self-identify as homosexual than the normal population. So if 98% of non-CH females are heterosexual, about 90% of CH females are heterosexual. So what we're getting at is hard to disentangle the genetic influence or the befuddling effects of their DSD with which they're struggling versus the environmental influences. You can understand a parent who loves their child dearly, but that child has a DSD. They may unintentionally treat that child differently, and we don't know how that has an organizing effect on their later sexual identity. It's just hard to disentangle all those things. We are never going to know this side of heaven. That's the truth, but it's there. So there is enough data that what we should do is say data from these kids should give us caution and cause us to pause before accepting a simplistic born this way argument. Let me move on. Do homosexuals or LGBTQ people have different brain structures than heterosexuals? This is a legitimate question. Their same-sex attraction is caused by men having brain structures more similar to average women and women having brain structures more similar to average men. So let me go ahead and tell you there are a lot of differences between male and female brains, but the big ones is two big ones pop out. First, it's typically because God designed the male cranium bigger than the female cranium, men have a larger brain volume than females on average. They have exactly the same number of neurons, same capacity for intelligence. It's just the male brain spreads out. Ladies, if you've ever said men have a big head, you are scientifically correct, right? That's right. So it has a larger volume. The other thing is the difference in the percentage of gray matter to white matter. And that's a really interesting one. It's very different between males and females on average. But when you look at the data, there's always overlap. There's always somebody in the middle where the data kind of gets crunched around together. These are trends. I will go ahead and tell you, when you talk about those really big differences, there's nothing that someone has found that really affirms conclusively those sort of differences between LGBTQ people and the majority of the population. I'm going to talk about one study. I'm a little bit cautious because there's something where you call a straw man argument where you present the weakest case as if you've refuted the strongest case. I don't think I'm doing that here. Simon LeVay is a freakishly smart guy. He was with the Salk Institute, and he is a neuroanatomist, and he's freakishly smart. He is homosexual. He had his first partner die of AIDS back in the 80s. And out of that, and I really think out of grief over his partner's death, he starts doing some research. And what he did was he got 41 cadavers, I think was the number. People volunteered for donating their bodies to science. And he was looking at a particular cell area called the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. And there's 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there's reasons why he did that based on some other research before him. But anyway, he's looking at this area of the hypothalamus, and he's wondering, does it correlate at any level with the homosexual identity? Just so you'll know, this is where it's at. It's a tiny area. This is from a later study, so you'll understand these are, someone's donated a brain to science. It's been sliced. It's been placed on a slide. And what you're looking at, that's what an INAH3. I want you to just focus on that gray area there. Even people who are affirmative of LeVay's argument, there's my preacher part of me. Did you notice some of you who know Christian authors, instead of LeVay, I said LaHaye? You know, some of you guys. So anyway, but it's Simon LeVay. Do you see how hard that would be to measure? Even people who are affirmative of LeVay's research agree, man, this is a really difficult part of the hypothalamus to measure. So to give you an idea, that's what it looks like. So what he claimed was that he had 41 cadavers. 19 of them he classified as homosexual, 16 as heterosexual males, and 6 as heterosexual women. So 19 gay males, 16 straight males, and 6 heterosexual women, although there's debate about the degree to which he's accurate on classifying these people. Anyway, what he claimed, and this is a major claim, the INAH3 cell group was twice as large in heterosexual men as heterosexual women and homosexual males. And so listen carefully to what he's saying. He's saying homosexual males have an INAH3 size that looks a lot like that of a regular heterosexual woman. So you see what he's saying. Heterosexual women are attracted to men, and it's because of their INAH3 size. Likewise, homosexual men are attracted to men, and it's because of their INAH3 size. You see what he's saying? You understand his claim? It's all about, well, the question is, does that actually drive your sexual attraction? That's a major question. It hasn't been proven that your INAH3 determines your sexual identity. So it's a hard thing to prove. But here is something I would point out to you. This is a reproduction of a chart in the article he published in 1991. And this is fascinating. I want you to look with me. To his credit, he put this in his material. Over on the left-hand side, he's got 6 females. In the middle, he's got 16 heterosexual males. In the right, he's got 19 homosexual males. His own data gives us reason to pause and question his claims. And let me explain to you. His own data shows that a particular INAH3 size is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause homosexuality. Look at the center column. You've got 3 heterosexual males who have an INAH3 size that is the same as the majority of the females and the majority of the homosexual males. What that means is that having a particular INAH3 size is not sufficient to cause homosexuality. That's what it means from his own data. Now look at the top. In the upper right-hand corner, you've got 3 homosexual males who have an INAH3 size the same as the majority of the heterosexual males. What that shows you is that a particular INAH3 size is not necessary. The middle column proves it's not necessary. The second column means it's not sufficient. Middle column means it's not sufficient. Second column means it's not necessary. I got it right. It's not necessary to have a particular INAH3 size to land somewhere on an LGBTQ spectrum. The other thing I would caution you about with this study is there are approximately 7 billion people on the face of planet Earth. And we are making global claims on a sample size of 41, including 6 females. I don't think that I'm using a straw man. He gets repeated a lot today. The data I read, this is 30 years old, and I will tell you, in the 30 years since then, there's been no clear replication of his data. No one has clearly replicated it. He's a fascinating guy. He's an advocate very much for what he believes. He is honest about his data, I'll give him that. So let's credit him for that. But his own data shows that particular brain structure is not necessary nor sufficient. Now, what do I tell you all about that? And the book I have, Born This Way, Homosexuality, Science, and Scripture, I walked through a lot of brain studies. All of them have some flaw like this. The sample size is freakishly small. There's overlap in the data. There's always some outliers that don't fit the premise that's trying to be proved. So what I would just tell you is that no one has discovered a gay brain. No one's discovered an LGBTQ brain. Well, what can we learn from twin studies? That would make sense to you. If you have identical twins with the same DNA, how does that work out when they get older? So I'm just going to tell you early on, there was some freakishly high data about the percentage of identical twins where both of them came out as homosexual. We now know those samples were all jacked up. The best data comes from Australia and Sweden. In those countries, they have twin registries, so you can actually find out data about every identical twin in those nations. And what you find is, among identical male twins, if you have one male twin who is homosexual, 20% of the time his co-twin is also homosexual. It's interesting, for females, if you have an identical twin who is a homosexual, 24% of the time her co-twin is almost homosexual. Now, this is interesting data. It tells us a couple of things. First of all, there might be a genetic influence at some level, but again, it's hard to disentangle the social aspects of the way these kids were raised. And you talked about trauma and how many of these kids, both of them had the trauma and only one of them had the trauma and all this sort of stuff. I want to say something right now. I don't have it on the slide, but would you write this down if you don't mind writing things down? The age of sexual debut, the context in which it occurs, and the gender of the person with whom it occurs all have a strong organizing effect on someone's later sexual identity. Let me repeat that. The age of sexual debut, that means first time you have sex. The context in which it occurs, and the gender of the person with whom it occurs all have a strong organizing effect on someone's later sexual identity. Simon LeVay, in his book on the gay brain, it's a fascinating read, but he made reference to something that you need to know about. A guy named Kazi Rahman, who's a homosexual psychologist that teaches at, I think, King's College in London, said the same thing, but listen carefully. If sexual trauma, childhood sexual trauma, occurs at a particular level, thankfully it's not as high as it could be, but it's a pretty low level among the general population. There's a small percentage of kids who have sexual trauma in their childhood. That makes sense. Someone abused them sexually when they're a child. Among people across the LGBTQ spectrum, it occurs about twice as often as it does in the general population. I want to be careful because I've had Christians say that's the majority of LGBTQ people. I don't think it's the majority have had sexual trauma, but much higher percentage than in the general population. So much so that people like Kazi Rahman and Simon LeVay have tried to explain it away because this is threatening to their theory, because what it suggests is there's a strong environmental impact on later sexual identity. I will tell you what Simon LeVay suggested. He said the reason that some, and he'll use this term, LGBTQ children. He's assuming they're already somewhere across the spectrum at 6 and 7. He said the reason why more of them had childhood sexual trauma, and I'm not taking him out of context and I'm not quote mining, is because they were already somewhere across the LGBTQ spectrum, and their abusers picked up on that, and that's why their abusers molested them. Do you understand what he's just done? It's victim blaming. It's your fault. It's your fault. You were abused because you were sending out signals you didn't even realize. What I would tell you is it's hard to disentangle all these things. But again, if somewhere south of 2% of the population identifies across the LGBTQ spectrum, but that number is growing, and you have 20 and 24% among identical twins, that should lead us to at least the hypothesis that a biological component is a contributing variable. That is, to say something is a contributing variable is far different from saying that it is determinative. There's all sorts of things that are contributing variables. I live in Kansas City. You guys live in Rhode Island. You have culinary delights in Rhode Island, which I've never had, but you've never had Kansas City barbecue. My favorite barbecue in Kansas City, the Gates family, is an African-American family that's been making barbecue for like 90 years. And some of you guys here that know about eschatology, premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, all that stuff, the best argument I've ever had for postmillennialism that the church will actually usher in the kingdom is Gates Barbecue. That's my best. It's amazing. And Miss Lisa doesn't like to go there. I love it. And so when she goes off to Bible study, I'll ride down there on my bike and I'll eat Gates Barbecue. When I get closer, I smell it and my mouth starts salivating. And when I go in, I order more than I need. I realize there's a bit of operant conditioning going on there because I've been before and I enjoyed it and I'm going back again. I'm like Pavlov's dogs. Amen. Give me more. But the point is, there's a part of that temptation over which I have no control. There's a biological variable to it. It shouldn't surprise us if there's a biological variable to everything we do. Everything we do on this life has a biological component because we live in a body. Shouldn't surprise us. So here's a response. The higher occurrence demonstrates the plausibility of some genetic factor exhibiting a low level of influence, but the data strongly questions the born this way claim. Why would I say that? Why would I say this data strongly questions the born this way claim? Why? Yes, sir. And if the born this way claim was absolutely true, the percentage would be 100%, and it's not. So homosexuality is not a trait like your hair or your skin color. Some have tried to suggest that the epigenome is the reason for this, but I won't get into that. Has science discovered a gay gene? Short answer, no. The theory, people are homosexual because they have a gene that drives that. The big, most famous argument for this comes from a guy named Dean Hamer. He's very much into determinism. He wrote a book in the 2005 or 2006, I can't remember. The title of the book is called The God Gene. He thinks some people believe in God because it's in their DNA. Anyway, he claimed that 33 out of 40 homosexual brother pairs in his sample co-inherited genetic information in an X chromosome in a region called XQ28. XQ28 is not a gene. It is a gene-dense region. XQ28 is not a chromosome. It's a region on a chromosome. So he claimed that there was something in that region. He was using a type of study called a gene linkage study that can't get you down to particular genes, but what it does is it points you in a general direction. So, for example, it's something like, if I told you a crime occurred in Kansas City last night. It's so great. Where? I said, well, in Kansas City. Well, where at in Kansas City? In the city. Well, where? In the city. Okay, there's 400,000 people. Where did it occur? I can't tell you. It just occurred in the city. His data's not quite that bad, but it's in that direction, if that helps you out any. That's just where it's at, just to show you I know how to do cut and paste on a picture. He did not claim to find a gay gene. He claimed to find a region where a gay gene might exist. By the way, it's also interesting, he didn't claim everyone in his sample had the same genetic coding at each of these sections either. He just said they had something in common. It's fascinating. There's so much that I could say about this, but you mentioned this article this morning. This came out after my book was published, and maybe the publisher will let me do a second edition. Because why not? People want to read more branch. But it's August 29th, 2019. They had a sample size of close to 500,000 people. In the years between Dean Hamer in 1993 and this article in 2019, the ability to map the map the dinos, the genome, the DNA in the genome, that's funny. It has rocketed forward several orders in magnitude, the speed at which this can be done. So DNA can be mapped down to the base pair. What is this, 1 billion base pairs or 2 billion base pairs, guys? I don't remember. It's a boatload. And they can do this at rapid, freakishly fast speed. So they do that with a sample size of 500,000 people. And they're trying to find, is there a gene for homosexuality? And what they discovered was this. Nothing on the X chromosome. By the way, I think Dean Hamer's thoroughly refuted out of this study. I still hear chatter about Hamer's research. I think it's refuted, but nonetheless. The lead author, Andrea Gana, said, and I quote, "There is no gay gene." Now, she wouldn't like my moral stance, but she's honest enough with data to say there's no gay gene. And she also, and her research team, suggested 8 to 25% of homosexual behavior is explained by genetics. I don't have a problem with that. That doesn't knock me out of my Jesus tree. Let me just tell you, about 25 to 40% of anything you do in life is influenced by your genetics at some point. Shouldn't surprise us. We are a body-soul unity. So here it is. No one's discovered a gay gene. don't worry about this, 5 single nucleotide polymorphisms of interest, but none of them rose to the level of statistical significance. That's just a G and an A, or an A and a T, or a G and a C that got turned around. Can't remember my numbers for DNA. There's no clear replication of data. The data has no predictive value. As I said last night, you can't go to Gillette Stadium, do a DNA sample of everyone there on a particular night to watch the Patriots play, and predict who's going to be homosexual out of that data. You can't do that with brain MRIs either, or brain information. Does having older brothers make some guys gay? This is called the fraternal birth order effect. And so the claim is that each older brother increases the odds of homosexuality by 33%. Let me just go ahead and tell you that half or more of all homosexual men have 0 older brothers. A 2006 study, the entire population of Denmark found no substantial birth order effect. So here's a summary. Homosexuality is not a trait like skin color. Contrary to popular opinion, scientific research has not found a gay gene. There is no conclusive evidence that homosexuals have a substantially different brain structure than heterosexuals. No variable has been discovered which is necessary and sufficient to cause homosexuality. A survey of modern scientific research demonstrates there are some factors with a low level of influence that correlate with a higher incidence of homosexuality among limited samples, but no biological or genetic factors have been discovered that cause homosexuality. Let me stop right here. Correlation does not equal causation. I don't have any tattoos. If I got one, it would say correlation does not equal causation. I would have that somehow. And I would just go to meetings and I would stand up in the back of the room. I just hold it up like that. But let me try to explain the correlation causation. Can I use a silly example? I'm going to use baseball. I'm assuming I'm around a lot of Red Sox fans. Okay, right. So I am from Kansas City, and we have a little team, the Royals. We love our little team, the Royals. And in 2015, won the World Series. It was a big deal. The city went nuts. It really did. The city went nuts. Imagine if someone said, hey, I've discovered that in the summer of 2015, ice cream sales increased dramatically in Kansas City. And that's the year the Royals won the World Series. You might have observed that our last few years have not quite been World Series seasons. Perhaps you've noticed that, right? Well, someone looking at that data might say, well, look, we've not been back to the World Series. Everyone in town needs to eat more ice cream so we can get the Royals back to the World Series. Because that year in 2015, ice cream sales went really up. Or it might be that in 2015, what was going on was, because the Royals were winning, more people went out to Kauffman Stadium, and when they were there, because nobody drinks beer in Kansas City. We can't even get a brewery to come to our town. I mean, nobody drinks beer there. Okay, I guess my humor just doesn't fly in Rhode Island, because I've been dying. Anyway, okay. So here's the deal. It might be that people go into Kauffman Stadium because the Royals are winning, and when they're there, it's in the summer, and they buy. You see what I'm saying? Which way does the correlation work? And we don't always know. What you need to know is correlation doesn't equal causation. That's true for a lot of things. It's especially important here. What about sexual orientation change efforts? I'm going to give you a summary. This is data that doesn't really make Christians or secular people happy on either side, but I'm just going to tell you basically what the data shows. Here's what I'd tell you. Movement on a continuum of change from exclusively homosexual to exclusively heterosexual occurs more frequently than secular people want to admit, but it doesn't occur as frequently as we as evangelicals would hope. So that's what I would tell you. It occurs more frequently than secular people want to admit, but it's not as frequent as evangelicals would hope. But what I would also tell you is new therapies are immediately labeled homophobic. Dr. Cotella mentioned sexual orientation change efforts. Back 50 years ago, people were doing horrible things. Yes, electric shock therapy. One guy was showing young boys who showed homosexual tendencies, who was showing them pornography to try to get them to be attracted to women. That's a bad idea. Well, what happens is you talk about straw man arguments, every sincere effort to try to help someone who is struggling with some sort of sexual temptation across the LGBTQ spectrum is immediately labeled conversion therapy. And conversion, whatever that is, it's wrong. Basically, conversion therapy has become such a big category, I don't even know what it means anymore other than you disagree with me. That's the basic summary. Here's what I would tell you. One of the most painful results of sin is that it's habit forming. Martin Luther said, we may not be able to choose the birds of temptation that fly over our head, but we can keep them from building nests in our hair. And the brain can construct neural pathways, and these pathways become reinforced and stronger each time we engage in various sins. Let me give you a little background on pornographic addiction. The idea is that every time the brain, or the humans, work with me. I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. Let me back up and say this again. Every time someone engages in pornography viewing, specifically males, I'm talking about male data now, they are reinforcing neural pathways to the pleasure center in the brain. And what starts out as a trail in the woods, like several hikers have been on it, you can tell where the trail is through the grass in the woods where hikers have been, sort of turns into a small Grand Canyon. And every woman gets dumped into that Grand Canyon, and they all become potential porn stars in the guy's mind. What happens? They are reinforcing over and over and over again. And I'm not trying to be overly simplistic, but you do fry your brain to a degree. Something like that goes on with all temptation, but it's particularly burdensome with sexual temptation and gender issues. And we need to be very, very careful that we can live out the consequences of Christ's warning. Everyone who sins becomes a slave to sin. It has a reinforcing value. This is a quote, Richard Isay. He was the first psychiatrist in the United States to come out as openly homosexual, and he disagreed with me on my moral stance. He's passed away now. But he said this, like all forms of love, homosexuality is a longing for a lost attachment. That longing for gay men is usually a father. And again, he thought an LGBTQ identity is good. But even he in his honest moments would say there's something else going on here. I'm asking you to grieve for people who've believed a lot of things. This is Lisa Diamond at the University of Utah. She said this, and I quote, she's pro-homosexual. I feel as a community, the queers have got, and that's a term they use, so it's not a put down. She's referring to it in a way that they would concur with. I feel as a community, the queers have got to stop saying, please help us. We are born this way and we can't change as an argument for legal standing. I don't think we need that argument, and that argument is going to bite us in the rear end because we know that there's enough data out there and the other side is aware of it as much as we are aware of it. That's an honest moment from one of their own researchers. And I suspect if you're talking about legal standing, in the long run, born this way arguments that are based on something like rights for ethnic minorities are going to fade away, and it's just going to become a moral autonomy argument. We just want to do this because what we want to do. That's what I predict. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about lots of other things.